Welcome to the debate. Today we are diving into one of the most compelling and, I think, complex theological tensions in the scriptural narrative, the relationship between an unconditional divine covenant and the necessary and often volatile condition of human freedom.
Right. This is really a debate about the mechanics of salvation history. When God makes a definitive promise, specifically the covenant about the Davidic lineage, does human failure, or for that matter human acceptance, actually condition its fulfillment? Or is the integrity of that promise ultimately secured by God's unwavering fidelity alone, making human choices, secondary to the divine resolve?
Exactly. So our central question today is whether the scriptural accounts, particularly the crisis of King Ahaz in Isaiah chapter 7, and its New Testament fulfillment with Joseph, primarily emphasize the sovereign predetermined fidelity of God, or the critical necessary freedom of human acceptance to realize that divine plan.
And I'll be arguing that the primary emphasis is on God's unwavering fidelity. The divine plan is, I believe, fundamentally secured by God's sovereignty, which overcomes human failure again and again. The promise persists, independent of human agency.
And I will be arguing that human freedom, whether it's manifested as a catastrophic failure or an essential acceptance, is a required condition for God's redemptive purpose in history to actually be realized. Freedom isn't just an obstacle God circumvents, but a mechanism he requires.
Okay, so let's look at the evidence, beginning with the crisis of Ahaz. The Ahaz narrative is, I think, a profound case study in divine sovereignty overcoming mortal weakness. We're situated around 735 BC. The young King Ahaz, who holds this unique position as the depository of faith for the Davidic dynasty, is paralyzed by panic. He's caught between the rising Assyrian Empire and the immediate threat of the Syro-Ephraimite coalition.
And his response is defined by a radical infidelity.
It is. The text explicitly records him sacrificing his unique son, an act that extinguished the dynastic hope in an immediate sense, and then deciding to seek military support from the brutal Assyrian emperor. Scholars emphasize that this decision, it swept away at a stroke all the work of liberation undertaken since Moses. This is covenantal violation at its most extreme. And yet, despite this extreme moral and religious infraction, Ahaz's hypocrisy, when he refuses Isaiah's offer of a sign claiming piety, prompts Isaiah's announcement that the Lord himself will give a sign. The pregnant woman will bear Emmanuel. This juxtaposition of the ultimate failure with the immediate unconditional renewal of the messianic promise proves that nothing, not even the complete failure of the reigning king, will prevent the fidelity promised by God to the descendants of David and to his people.
Well, I see why you draw that conclusion about God's ultimate commitment, but let me give you a different perspective on the importance of human choice. While God is unquestionably faithful to the covenant itself, the unfolding and, the historical manifestation of the divine plan relies crucially on the free, active acceptance of righteous individuals. And this creates a necessary contrast with the destructive freedom Ahaz exercised.
But the ultimate prophecy of Emmanuel survives Ahaz's actions.
The ultimate messianic promise survives, yes. But Ahaz's lack of faith was far from benign. His choice to prioritize immediate political safety over Isaiah's counsel to trust God cost him his political and religious independence. Commentators are clear. By refusing faith, his choice led directly to the subsequent political collapse, where the Assyrian Empire crushed the kingdoms of Syria and Samaria. Human choices, whether they're faithful or faithless, have profound, immediate historical consequences. It demonstrates that freedom is a powerful causal mechanism in the flow of history. Now contrast this with the New Testament fulfillment in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew presents a clear rupture in the Davidic genealogy. Jesus is conceived by the Holy Spirit, not physically engendered by Joseph. This means the restoration of the Davidic line is now entirely dependent on a free human act. So we're told the design of God is suspended on the acceptance, the goodwill of a man, Joseph. Joseph, who is introduced as a just man, chose to obey the angel's instruction to not be afraid and adopt Jesus thereby introducing Jesus legally into the Davidic lineage. His free acceptance was a required, indispensable condition for the beginning of Jesus' human history.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I mean, even Joseph's acceptance, while free, is presented by Matthew as the necessary, foreseen mechanism for accomplishing the promise that was already announced to Ahaz. Joseph's obedience serves the stability of the pre-existing divine promise. Let's return to the interpretation of Ahaz's specific failure. His conduct was labeled by scholars as abominably hypocritical and a grave lack of confidence in God. Yet the text uses this very moment of ultimate moral failure, what some call the characteristic sabotage of the dynasty's future, to immediately pivot to the announcement of Emmanuel. This radical juxtaposition showcases God's unconditional pardon and the unbreakable nature of the covenant despite the king's deliberate crime.
See, that's where I struggle with the idea that the covenant is entirely divorced from the immediate consequences of human action. If the covenant was truly unconditional in its operational sense, why did God send Isaiah to Achaz in the first place, demanding faith and offering a sign? And why did the concrete immediate result of Achaz's bad choice resolve his political crisis by exactly the means he sought, the Assyrians crushing his enemies? That entire political collapse, which was foreseen by Isaiah, was the direct historical consequence of Achaz choosing temporary security over covenant fidelity. His actions were consequential. And in stark contrast, Joseph, when he's confronted with a crisis, Mary's unexpected pregnancy, is presented as a just man who chose to act in secret and later chose to obey the angel in a public, life-altering manner. This deliberate free choice is absolutely vital. We see scholarly commentary elevating this choice, saying, "Blessed is Joseph who believed. Thanks to him, God was able to accomplish his design of salvation." This translation makes it clear human freedom is an active, essential mechanism of salvation history, not just a passive, lamentable hurdle God must always vault over.
The core difference here is whether human action is a prerequisite for the covenant's survival or a response made possible by the prerequisite of divine action. I argue it is the latter. The stability of the divine plan allows for the response of figures like Joseph, but the plan itself doesn't hang in the balance of their individual free will.
Well, this brings us nicely out of the specific historical events and into the theological framework of the New Testament. Let's turn to Paul's letters and his concept of the relationship between God and man, specifically in Romans 1, verse 5, regarding the obedience of faith. The ultimate goal of the apostolic mission is to bring nations to this obedience. So what does Paul mean by obeisance de la foi?
It's a foundational concept, and it tells us a great deal about the necessity of human volition. Paul, who is deeply rooted in the Old Testament concept of hearing the word, defines this obedience not as servility or abasement before an autocrat, but as confident listening, l'écoute confiante, which he calls the attitude filiale par excellence.
Okay, so how does that definition support the necessity of freedom?
It reframes belief itself as an active, confident response, a choice of radical trust, similar to Joseph's choice, which is required to welcome the grace and peace that is always offered by God. If grace is an unconditional reality, why does Paul spend so much time campaigning for this obedience of faith if the outcome is already guaranteed for the believer?
That is precisely where I find the tension. I'm not convinced that the response is the conditioning element. The possibility of that filial obedience flows directly from a prior, accomplished fact established entirely by divine fidelity. The foundation for the obedience of faith is the prior assurance that the gospel is genuinely good news, bonne nouvelle, and that the design of God is only benevolent. The confident listening you describe is only possible because the listener knows the speaker is perfectly faithful and trustworthy.
So the fidelity precedes and enables the faith.
Absolutely. The reason one can achieve that confident obedience is because Christ's resurrection, which scholars call the event that shatters the face of the world, has already established him as king. Paul explicitly states Christ was established in his power as Son of God by his resurrection. The fidelity and accomplishment of the Father precede and enable the faith and obedience of the human agent. The human is responding to a victory already won. Their obedience is the effect of that victory being applied to their lives, not the cause of the victory's necessity.
But if the victory's already won and the promise is completely guaranteed by God's power, why the need for the human choice to listen confidently at all? We have to examine how Paul frames the delivery of grace and peace. When Paul speaks of these blessings, he uses the optative mood, often expressed grammatically through the subjunctive, wishing that grace and peace be with you. Commentators stress that this grammatical construction explicitly says our freedom. It expresses a strong desire or prayer for the outcome, which implies that the outcome is dependent, at least in part, on the recipient's free, active assent. If it were purely an unconditional decree, the indicative mood would suffice. The use of the subjunctive maintains a space for human choice, acknowledging that grace is offered, but our willful, active assent is required to receive it.
But that space for choice only exists because God, in his fidelity, allows it to exist. To me, the choice itself is evidence of God's benevolence, but not evidence that God's plan is dependent on that choice. If the good news is guaranteed, then the response is ultimately a demonstration of the efficacy of the divine plan, not a necessary step to secure it.
Let's shift focus from Paul's letters back to the Old Testament to the conditions for being in God's presence, which I think reinforces the necessity of active choice. This brings us to Psalm 23. The psalm asks the fundamental question, who can ascend the mountain of the Lord, or who can stand in his holy place? And the answer is provided. The man with a pure heart, with innocent hands. You've interpreted this traditionally as a primarily theological condition.
I maintain that the core requirement is theological purity. Purity in the Old Testament context is primarily about adherence to the one God. It is about being without mixture in one's faith, turning resolutely toward God alone and refusing syncretism.
So the requirement of innocent hands simply means hands that have not offered sacrifices to idols?
Precisely. This focus on exclusive worship, the primary condition of the covenant, re-emphasizes that maintaining the purity of the relationship is the prerequisite, a demand which the Davidic covenant exists to guarantee. It's about theological orientation, first and foremost, which is the only thing God fundamentally demands.
That's a compelling starting point, but I believe the material insists on a deeper, chosen moral orientation. While purity certainly begins with rejecting idols, what some commentators call the empty gods, the required purity leads inevitably to concrete social and ethical consequences. The psalmist is requiring a sustained moral posture. The pure heart in this context does not just reject idols, it becomes a heart of flesh that no longer knows hatred, and the innocent hands will no longer do evil against one's neighbor.
But are those not the fruits of a faithful relationship rather than the initial condition for entering God's presence?
I disagree on the separation. The covenantal relationship is defined by conformity to God's project, and that project immediately engages us to conform all our social life to the project of God. The concept of justice, referenced later in the psalm, confirms this. So the condition for standing in God's presence requires a persistent, chosen moral and social orientation in life. Achaz's actions were abominable not just because they were idolatrous, but because they involved sacrificing his son, a horrific ethical failure tied to his lack of faith. Joseph's choice was righteous because it required him to override the social shame and act with justice toward Mary. Human action, choice, and sustained ethical integrity remain inextricably linked to divine accessibility.
But those ethical imperatives are only derived from the prior fidelity of the covenant itself. God requires justice because God is just, and he commits to those who adhere to him exclusively. The core promise is that if you turn to God alone, he will be there. The stability resides in his character and commitment, which brings us back to the inherent stability of the covenant itself. My core position remains that the overarching message, spanning from Isaiah's desperate plea to Ahaz to Paul's assurance to the Romans, is that God's benevolent design is foreseen since the dawn of the world. The certainty that God is with us, Emmanuel, is the final promise given at the end of Matthew's gospel. I am with you all the days until the end of time. This ultimate sovereign assurance transcends the specific, often tragic choices of individual kings or generations. God's commitment to salvation is the fixed star.
And yet, we cannot ignore the material highlighting that the Son of God is delivered into the hands of men. This profound statement underscores the necessity of human free choice. Whether it is the destructive freedom that Ahaz leveraged to sabotage his dynasty and incur political ruin, or the necessary, saving, filial acceptance of Joseph, which allowed the messianic plan to proceed into human history. The core tension is between the stability of the divine promise and the volatile yet required nature of human assent, belief, and action.
A volatility which, thankfully, God always subordinates to his ultimate purpose.
Indeed, the texts encourage the listener to recognize that while the great promise of God's presence is firm, the opportunity for any individual or generation to live in his presence, to experience the full reality of grace and peace, depends entirely on continuing to make choices of faith, trust, and active righteousness. This necessity for human acceptance is what keeps the covenant alive in history, and there is much more in this material to explore.